Today's video is brought to you by CuriosityStream. CuriosityStream is a subscription streaming service that offers thousands of documentaries and non-fiction titles from some of the world's best filmmakers, including exclusive originals. CuriosityStream is available on many platforms and web apps, including Roku, Android, Xbox One, smart TVs, iOS, Chromecast, Amazon Fire, Amazon Kindle, and Apple TV. That's a lot! It's offered worldwide and it's constantly updated with awesome timely content. Right now, for instance, they have a popular new documentary series called The Top Science Stories of 2020, obviously features profile on COVID-19, but also dives into CRISPR, the Mars rover, fossilized DNA, and several other exciting news stories that you might have missed last year. Now, today's video is going to heavily focus on the destructive nature of war, specifically the effects of bombing during World War II. Appropriately, I'm recommending a two-part CuriosityStream documentary called Bombing War from Guernica to Hiroshima. If you find today's video interesting, you should definitely take advantage of a trial offer from CuriosityStream and go check that out. Right now, you guys can go to curiositystream.com/brainfeed and get unlimited access to the world's top documentaries and non-fiction series, and it costs just $2.99 a month or $19.99 for the whole year. And you guys can get a 30-day free trial. Just use the code BRAINFOOD at checkout, and let's get into the video. 137 kilometers southwest of Salt Lake City stands a peculiar structure conspicuously out of place amid its surroundings. This pair of two-story stone tenement blocks looks as though they were lifted straight out of 1920s Berlin and dropped into the middle of the Utah desert. Known as the German Village, this misplaced slice of Weimar Germany was constructed by the US Army in 1943 in support of one of the most destructive campaigns in modern military history, one which would see hundreds of German and Japanese cities and hundreds of thousands of their residents go up in flames. Following the evacuation of the British Expeditionary Force from Dunkirk in May 1940, the only weapon the British had with which to strike back at Nazi Germany was the Royal Air Force's Bomber Command. At first, RAF bombers attempted to carry out precision daylight raids, striking only military targets such as arms factories, railroads, and marshalling yards, and avoiding civilian casualties as much as possible. The prevailing wisdom of the interwar years held that a sufficiently fast and well-armed bomber would always get through and attack its target with impunity. In practice, however, this notion was proven disastrously wrong as German fighters and anti-aircraft artillery decimated the British daylight bombers. Facing annihilation, the RAF soon switched to bombing at night. But while this made bomber crews safer, it also made precision bombing of individual targets impossible, forcing Bomber Command to rethink its entire strategy. The new doctrine they adopted was known as area bombing, and it targeted large, highly populated urban centers and had two main objectives. First, to dehouse Germany's workers, disrupting its wartime economy, and second, to demoralize the German people so they would rise up and depose the Nazi government. Many in the British government were horrified by this strategy as it specifically targeted civilians, completely obliterating the line between combatants and non-combatants. But the mastermind of the campaign, Air Marshal Arthur Bomber Harris, justified it as well-deserved comeuppance for the London Blitz of 1940 to 1941, stating in a now infamous speech that the Nazis entered this war under the rather childish delusion that they were going to bomb everyone else and nobody was going to bomb them. At Rotterdam, London, Warsaw, and half 100 other places, they put their rather naive theory into operation. They sowed the wind, and now they are going to reap the whirlwind. For maximum effect, RAF bombers began using incendiary bombs to set entire cities alight. Through trial and error, these tactics were honed to a science, with aircraft first dropping heavy blockbuster bombs to blow the roofs off buildings and houses, followed up by incendiaries to set fires in the now exposed attics, and finally regular high-explosive bombs to kill firefighters and rescue crews, allowing the fires to spread out of control. This technique was used to devastating effect in late July 1943 during Operation Gomorrah, a week-long bombing raid against the city of Hamburg. An unusually long and hot summer had turned the city into a tinderbox, causing it to erupt into a firestorm, a tornado of flame that generated temperatures of 800 degrees Celsius and winds of up to 250 kilometers an hour. Many residents were swept off their feet and into the inferno, while others huddling in bomb shelters suffocated as the flames sucked out all the oxygen. In the end, more than 61% of the city's housing was destroyed, and over 37,000 people perished, a full 2.5% of the city's population. Meanwhile, the Americans who had joined the war in late 1941 were aghast at the British area bombing campaign, with Secretary of War Henry Stimson declaring, "I don't want the United States to get the reputation of outdoing Hitler in atrocities." Winston Churchill dismissed these concerns, stating, "It is absurd to consider morality on this topic. I want the matter studied in cold blood by sensible people and not by psalm-singing uniformed defeatists." Nonetheless, the US Army Air Force clung doggedly to the doctrine of precision bombing of purely military targets, bombing by day while the British bombed by night. But soon they learned the same hard lessons the British had learned earlier in the war, their slow-moving bombers proving easy prey for marauding German fighters, while new tactics like the introduction of long-range fighter escorts improved the situation somewhat. As the losses mounted, the Americans grew less and less averse to the idea of area bombing. In 1943, Air Marshal Harris proposed Operation Thunderclap, a joint Anglo-American raid on Berlin that would kill an estimated 220,000 people and bombard Berlin until the heart of Nazi Germany had stopped beating. There was only one problem. While British firebombing tactics had worked great against cities such as Hamburg, prior raids had shown that they were ineffective against Berlin. As incendiary bomb expert Horatio Bond explained, "The building quality is higher, and the single blocks are better separated from each other, and it is hardly to be expected that the flames will jump unhindered from one building to the next." In order to develop new bombing techniques for use on Berlin, in May 1943, the US War Department contracted the Standard Oil Development Company to build replica German buildings on the Dugway Proving Ground in Utah, established a year before as a chemical warfare testing range. Nicknamed the German Village, the installation was actually a recreation of a standard worker tenements of the kind found in Berlin's working-class districts of Wedding, Kreuzberg, and Pankow. The structures were largely designed by German architect Erich Mendelsohn, who in the 1920s had designed many famous buildings in Berlin, including the Moss Building, Columbus House, and the Einstein Tower Observatory. After being denied entry in the Prussian Academy of Arts in 1933 due to his Jewish heritage, he emigrated first to Britain and then to the United States, where he joined the famed Circle of Ten group of expatriate German architects. In the German Village, Mendelssohn saw an opportunity to get his revenge on the Nazi regime, though in one of history's little ironies, the Berlin districts the US Army was planning to destroy were former communist strongholds and virulently anti-Hitler. The US Army strove to make the German Village as realistic as possible, consulting with experts on German framing and joinery techniques to ensure that the structures exactly matched their Berlin counterparts. As actual German wood could not be obtained, Baltic lumber was brought in from Murmansk in Russia and aged following German standards. Set builders from RKO Studios in Hollywood, who had previously worked on the propaganda film Hitler's Children, were brought in to construct the heavy German furniture that would fill the dummy apartments. No detail was considered too insignificant, especially if it contributed to the spread of flames, so closets were even filled with clothing, beds covered with blankets, and children's toys strewn across the floors. As the Utah desert was significantly drier than Berlin, steam radiators and fire hoses were used to achieve the correct level of humidity. The only way in which the tenements deviated from reality was in their height. As incendiary bombs were only expected to penetrate into the building's attics, the structures were only raised to 2 stories rather than the 7 of the Berlin originals. Next door to the German Village stood the Japanese Village, a similar recreation of a residential district from a large Japanese city like Tokyo. While the German Village consisted of a single duplex structure divided into 6 apartment units, the Japanese Village was built as 12 freestanding duplex apartments standing in 4 rows. The buildings were designed by Czech architect Antonin Raymond, who had spent many years working in Japan, and Russian-born Boris Laming, who in 1923 had studied the effects of the Great Kanto earthquake on Japanese cities. As with the German Village, no effort was spared to make the buildings as authentic as possible. Many materials, however, proved difficult to obtain, forcing the army to come up with substitutes. For example, Russian spruce was substituted for sugi wood and Douglas fir for hinoki, while tatami mats, which cover much of the floors of Japanese houses, are highly flammable, and they were replaced with replicas woven from agave fiber. Using inmate labor from the nearby Utah State Prison, both villages were constructed in only 44 days, and by May 1943 were ready for use. Over the next 4 months, German and Japanese villages were bombed and completely rebuilt 3 times, yielding valuable data. For instance, it was found that while Japanese buildings were easier to set fire to, German buildings with their heavy wooden roof beams and furnishings were more likely to burn out of control. The experiments also convinced the Army Air Force to switch from their older magnesium and phosphorus-based incendiaries to the new AN-M50 bomb filled with a newly developed jellied gasoline called napalm, which burned hotter and was harder to put out. Finally, the tests revealed that the incendiaries used against German cities would not work as well against Japanese ones, as instead of just penetrating the roof of the attic, these bombs would punch all the way through to the weaker Japanese structures and explode in the ground. The US Army thus developed the smaller, lighter M69 cluster bomb for use against Japanese cities. While the original Thunderclap plan was never carried out, a modified operation was launched in February 1945 against the city of Dresden, unleashing the largest firestorm since Hamburg and killing 40,000 people. The raid was as much about intimidating the Soviet Union as defeating the Germans, with Bomber Harris stating, "The complete destruction of the inner city of a metropolis as large as Berlin would convince our Russian allies and the neutral states of the striking power of the Anglo-American air forces. On the 3rd of February 1945, 1,500 bombers of the US 8th Air Force, armed with tactics and bombs developed thanks to the German village experiments, launched their largest ever raid on Berlin. Though they did not succeed in starting a Hamburg or Dresden-style firestorm, over a quarter of the city was flattened and 10,000 Berliners were killed. But this was nothing compared to the destruction wrought by American firebombing raids over Japan. In a single raid, on the night of March 9, 1945, 334 B-29 Superfortress bombers dropped 2,000 tons of incendiaries on Tokyo, destroying over 260,000 buildings and killing more than 100,000 people, more than the atomic bombings of either Hiroshima or Nagasaki. It was the single deadliest air raid in military history. By the time the Second World War ended in August 1945, the Allied Strategic Bombing Command had killed more than 600,000 German and 500,000 Japanese citizens and destroyed nearly 50% of both countries' housing. Debate still rages as to whether this destruction was justified, with contemporary research revealing that the Allied bombing campaign yielded few of the results its planners had anticipated. Dehoused workers simply moved in with family, friends, and neighbors, while far from demoralizing the German populace, the bombing actually galvanized their resolve in the same manner as the UK's legendary Blitz spirit. Given the countless complex variables at play, the question of whether the bombings actually shortened the war and saved Allied lives will likely never fully be answered. After the war, the buildings at Dugway Proving Ground were used to test chemical and biological weapons before being sealed off due to contamination. Though the Japanese village is long gone, the twin tenements of the German village still stand, a lonely monument to a dark period in history and what historian Mike Davis calls the self-righteousness of punishing bad places by bombing them. So I really hope you found that video interesting. If you did, please do hit that thumbs up button below. Don't forget to subscribe, and as always, thank you for watching.